April 2nd, 2025, a day that, on the surface, passed like any other. No breaking news, no sirens. Just a whisper across the Canadian Rockies, a pulse beneath the Pacific waters, and a signature that may go down as one of the most consequential geopolitical shifts of the 21st century. While Americans turned their attention toward another chaotic election cycle and the usual Twitter drama, Canada quietly did something unimaginable. It broke free. Not with fanfare, but with flow, 890,000 barrels of oil per day, redirected not to Texas, but to Tianjin. To understand the significance of this moment, you need to know where it all began. For over 60 years, the United States and Canada had a mutually beneficial albeit imbalanced energy relationship. Canada, with its vast oil sands and relentless extraction industry, became the United States' silent supplier, not just a trading partner, but a near-satellite resource hub, tied by pipelines and policies, its crude oil flowing south at a discount, refined in American facilities, priced in American markets. It wasn't just business, it was dependence, but that dependency was never mutual. Canada's landlocked resources faced limited routes to global markets. Without access to deep water ports, its oil was essentially trapped, and so it flowed where it could, south. Refineries in Texas and the Midwest were designed specifically for Canada's heavy, sour crude, creating a technical and economic chokehold. But beneath that transactional flow, resentment grew. For decades, Canadian producers watched their oil devalued simply for being Canadian. A $10 to $20 per barrel discount was not uncommon. Billions in lost profits, billions in leverage. That all changed with one piece of infrastructure, the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, known as TMX, after a decade of political battles, environmental protests, court challenges, and construction delays. TMX came online in mid-2024. It tripled Canada's export capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day. More than just steel and valves, TMX was liberation. It connected Alberta's oil sands directly to Burnaby, British Columbia, opening access to the Pacific Ocean. Suddenly, Canada wasn't just America's energy backyard. It was a player on the global stage. At first, the U.S. didn't blink. American officials saw TMX as a side project, an inconsequential move by a polite neighbor. But everything shifted in early 2025 when former President Donald Trump, returning to the political spotlight, announced a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas. Framed as a national security maneuver, it was anything but. It was economic intimidation, a power play to reassert dominance. But for the first time, Canada didn't flinch. Behind closed doors, far from Washington's glare, a new deal was being signed. A sleek tower in downtown Calgary became the stage for a quiet revolution. Rangpro Chemical, one of China's largest private refiners, inked a contract with Suncor Energy for 200,000 barrels of oil per month. Starting in June 2025, the oil would bypass American refineries entirely, loaded onto VLCC tankers off the British Columbia coast, bound for China. To most, it looked like a regular trade agreement. To insiders, it was the unraveling of a 60-year alliance. This deal wasn't just about oil, it was about autonomy, leverage, and geopolitical realignment. For China, Canadian oil represents something invaluable, an alternative. An escape route from the Strait of Hormuz, a region mired in conflict and controlled by rival powers. A way to insulate its economy from American pressure. And for Canada, it was a moment of clarity. No longer tethered to U.S. pricing, no longer forced into economic subordination, Canada saw its oil valued at a premium, not a discount, as Chinese refiners signed multi-year FOB contracts with Canadian producers, not just Suncor, but Cenovus, CNRL, and even European giants like BP and Shell operating in the oil sands. It became clear that this wasn't a one-off shipment. It was the birth of a new energy axis. The oil didn't just flow west, influence did too. Each barrel sent to China represented one less sent to the United States, and that imbalance came with consequences. American refineries, optimized over decades for Canadian heavy crude, now faced a supply crunch. Alternatives like Venezuelan or Nigerian oil were either politically volatile or chemically incompatible. Saudi Arabia could fill some of the gap, but at a higher price and with less reliability. Goldman Sachs issued a warning. A sustained redirection of Canadian oil to Asia could spike U.S. crude prices by $5 to $10 per barrel. At the pump, that's 80 cents more per gallon. And it's not just theory, it's math. But here's where it gets deeper. Canada isn't just selling oil, it's buying influence. In 2024, the Canadian government launched a $6.5 billion global markets accelerator, a war chest to help its energy producers break into new markets. $5 billion for oil and gas infrastructure, $1 billion in trade insurance to protect farmers affected by U.S. retaliation. It was a message to the world. Canada is no longer America's sidekick. That same year, Canada also fast-tracked LNG Canada, a $40 billion liquefied natural gas project in Kitimat, BC, set to export 14 million tons of LNG annually to China, Japan, and South Korea, nations with energy demand growing at 8% per year. The first shipment, December 2025, and that's not the end. Arctic LNG routes are already being explored to supply Europe, filling the vacuum left by Russian exports. A post-Ukraine, post-OPEC energy map is emerging, and Canada is redrawing it. Meanwhile, hydro exports tell their own story. In 2024, Canada exported 42 terawatt-hours of electricity to the United States. Enough to power over 4 million American homes, revenue over $2 billion. But now, provinces like Ontario and Quebec are signaling possible cuts to those exports in retaliation for tariffs. Electricity, once a symbol of cooperation, is now a bargaining chip. This isn't economic policy. It's economic warfare, but done with a smile. No threats, no embargoes, just cold, calculated redirection. And by 2035, projections say Canada could be earning over $500 billion annually from energy exports, oil, gas, LNG, and hydro combined. Every BTU sold to Asia is one less piece of leverage for the US for the first time in modern history. America can't assume energy loyalty. And that shift is existential. It doesn't just affect oil prices. It affects everything: manufacturing, logistics, inflation, political stability. In Washington, they're still waiting for Canada to blink. But Ottawa isn't blinking, it's building. What started as a pipeline has become a geopolitical earthquake. And as we close this first chapter, the realization sets in: the United States didn't lose a partner. It lost control, and for an empire built on energy dominance, that's not just a crack, it's a fault line. In the global energy chessboard, that principle just became Canada's trump card. For decades, the United States assumed that energy flowed through its pipelines, its policies, and its pricing desks. It dictated terms, wielded energy as soft power, and built an economy on the assumption that the world, especially Canada, would always play along. But what happens when a quiet neighbor starts playing a different game entirely? Let's start with this uncomfortable truth. American refineries weren't just optimized for Canadian oil, they were dependent on it. Over 60% of all oil imported into the US comes from Canada. That's nearly 4 million barrels a day. Heavy sour crude that American refineries are specifically calibrated to process. This isn't plug and play. These facilities have billions invested in configuration, equipment, chemical balancing, all designed for one type of input: Canada's oil sands. So when even 20% of that supply begins to vanish, as it now is with TMX in full swing and Asia in buying mode, the US doesn't just feel a pinch. It hits the wall, supply tightens, prices rise. The economy reacts instantly. And the knock-on effects ripple logistics, retail, manufacturing, even agriculture. It all connects. Let's talk numbers. Goldman Sachs warned of a $5 to $10 per barrel spike if Canadian oil is rerouted en masse. At the consumer level, this translates to up to 80 cents more per gallon. And it gets worse when McKinsey modeled potential refinery shutdowns if Canadian flows fall below safe thresholds. This isn't about market fluctuation, it's about structural failure. Canada responded by fast-tracking energy partnerships with China, Japan, Korea, India, and even Germany. LNG deals, crude shipments, electricity alignments, all moving eastward or overseas. Every time a ship leaves Burnaby bound for Shanghai, America's leverage shrinks. And while Canada builds relationships, America builds walls, sanctions, tariffs, isolationist policies. It's an old playbook in a new world, and it's failing. Because power today isn't about control. It's about options. Canada now has them. The U.S. doesn't. Energy shaped the 20th century. Coal fueled the British Empire. Oil made America a superpower. Natural gas turned Russia into a geopolitical force. But the 21st century? It belongs to whoever can adapt first. And quietly, Canada has made its move. By 2035, conservative estimates suggest Canada could rake in $500 billion annually from energy exports. That's oil, gas, hydro, and LNG. Combined, it makes Canada one of the top energy powers globally. But this isn't just about revenue, it's about relationships. Every new customer in Asia, every new contract in Europe shifts the global balance. In the past, Canada had one beer. Now it has dozens, and that changes everything. Consider the architecture of energy diplomacy. For decades, OPEC Plus nations like Saudi Arabia and Russia controlled the narrative. Their coordination, pricing power, and strategic exports made them unavoidable. But they also came with baggage, political instability, authoritarian regimes, supply unreliability. Canada, by contrast, offers something rare: stability, transparency, and legal accountability. It's not perfect, but it's trusted. In a world rattled by wars, climate change, and economic upheaval, that trust is currency. What's more, Canada's environmental performance is improving. While oil sands were once seen as dirty, innovations in carbon capture, extraction efficiency, and green energy reinvestment are flipping the narrative. And that matters to global buyers. ESG ratings aren't just PR, they're prerequisites for deals in Europe and Asia. Canada is aligning with the future. And then there's hydro, with global electrification accelerating. Clean electricity is gold. Canada has an abundance and the infrastructure to export it. If Ontario and Quebec cut exports to the U.S. by even 30%, it would trigger massive regional energy shocks. The U.S. knows it, but there's little it can do. Because Canada isn't posturing, it's planning. Meanwhile, China is playing its own long game. It doesn't want domination, it wants insulation. Diversifying its energy imports away from the Persian Gulf and U.S. influence is strategic survival. Canadian oil gives China leverage without entanglement, and Canada? It gets a market of 1.4 billion consumers, hungry for energy. The irony, in its attempt to dominate, the U.S. accelerated its own marginalization. Trump's tariff, a power move, has become his biggest regret. It catalyzed a reordering of alliances that may take generations to reverse. The United States still imports over 3.9 million barrels of oil from Canada every day. But that number is shrinking, and with every ship that sails west instead of south, America's power dims slightly. This is the new energy world order, decentralized, multipolar, no longer dictated by Washington or Riyadh, but shaped by emerging exporters like Canada and buyers like China, India, and the EU. Canada doesn't need to sever ties with the US, it just needs to diversify. And that's exactly what it's doing, quietly, strategically, permanently. So the next time you hear about a new pipeline project in Canada, or an LNG terminal or a hydroelectric upgrade, pay attention. It's not just construction, it's geopolitics. And the world is watching ... because the most powerful moves in history aren't made on battlefields. They're made in boardrooms, on docks, in data centers, and yes, through pipelines. April 2nd, 2025, a silent revolution. A quiet realignment, not with a bang, but with a flow. You saw it here first.